Hello and welcome to a brand new miniature painting video series from Heroes Infinite. Today we are going to be painting Lady Kaelithra, the Spinebreaker, and she is from the Chaos Across the Galaxy Part 2 release. This release is currently available at a super low price, so head on over to heroesinfinite.com and treat yourself to a truly wonderful miniature experience. I painted the skin with a mix of mahogany brown, laser magenta and brown rose. And the first layers here is I'm just picking out the sort of mid-tone or higher details on the skin as I primed the model black and then oversprayed it with dirty red. So I wanted to keep the red tone all the way over the model here, so I could just paint mid-tones over the top. For the highlighting of the skin, I just add in more and more brown rose for each successive layer. And what we do here is I'm just picking out the highest spots of the skin, like the tops of the cheekbones, the tip of the nose, the upper lip, and the forehead area and the chin. And I just make each layer smaller and smaller and build up to get a nice tone and nice contrast on the face. Once everything's laid down here, I move on to add in a bit more blending and a little bit more colour here. So I've put on my palette blood red and I've thinned it down to a glaze, as you saw on my thumb there, and I'm painting this away from the midtones and the highlights and pushing that colour into the deepest shadows. This gives, especially on the cheeks, it gives it a nice depth to the overall face. The eyes I'm painting now, I block them in with blue-grey. So it's important not to use white when you do the eyes. They look far too stark. And here I've just got a little bit of black and I'm just dotting in the iris. For the lips, because they were already the red colour, there's just a basic highlight of blood red. Onto the grey cloth. There's not a lot of this, but I mix up a grey mix of black, dirty red and some basic skin tone. And I'm just painting most of the parts with this colour. It's important to make it look grey and not too red. I want this to be a separate element. Now, when I highlight this, I'm adding in more basic skin tone. This is a good way to do greys. If you just do greys with black and white, you get something that's very sort of bland and very sort of stark. So I find that adding a light pastel type colour like a peach, pastel green, or in this case a basic skin tone, actually makes the grey look a lot more vibrant. And I just finish this off with quite a light greyish mix and just hitting the top parts and the edges of the part around the neck to finish these grey parts. On to the red armour, which is one of the biggest features of this miniature, which I wanted to make look really cool. And I'm actually going with the colour that I sprayed over the top here. So this is dirty red, and again, a bit like the other areas, I'm literally painting the midtones here. So I'm leaving a lot of the shadow colour showing once I've painted this first layer. And I go over a couple of times here to build this colour, as you know, red doesn't have great coverage a lot of the time, and I want to make sure that this red looks red and not a sort of dirty brown or, you know, a slightly, you know, muted colour. So I make sure I build up this red nice. Now to this red, I progressively add matte red into this. Now matte red is a bit more of a sort of orangey red. It's a lovely colour, and it works as a lovely highlight tone. And what I'm doing here is I'm focusing on all the areas that are looking upwards towards the sky. And I want to build these to quite small, sharp highlights. So by doing this, we can make this almost look like a red NMM. So as you can see on the top plates on the breastplate, we're getting smaller and smaller little round areas, focusing on those highlights and building them up to quite a light value for the red. It's important we don't do, when we start adding in whiter colours, like I add in basic skin tone as well here to add like a light value. We don't want those highlights to be too big. Otherwise we end up with something that just looks very pink. So when we're painting something like this, more of a sort of NMM type style, we have to keep those bright highlights very, very small. And here I've mixed up King Purple, and I'm actually edge lining a lot of the parts of the armour, and I'm adding in some very deep shading with this purple tone. And again, with NMM, we want that contrast of extremely light to extremely dark. And this King Purple is very, very dark, almost black. And this will finish this armour off really nicely and give us some really nice contrast and some really nice definition. Now painting steel or shiny steel, it's a bit like we did the red armour here. So my first mix here is star blue, a bit of grey blue and a bit of black. A very nice sort of bluey grey sort of mid-tone. As you can see here, I'm going around first of all and I built up my mid-tones, and now I've gone with straight grey blue to make a big jump to the light values. We want this to very much appear as steel and an NMM, so it's important to get very dark colours, our sort of shadow areas, and our mid-tone is nice and colourful, but then we want to get up to those light values to create a very bright contrast. And at the end here, I just add more and more white in till I almost get to pure white on just, as you can see here, very little dots, very small parts, which give that sort of shiny bling effect to the NMM. And it really finishes it off nicely. Now gold is one of my favourite things to paint, and on this model it was no exception. I really enjoyed it. I have a very simple method here for gold, and don't forget we've already got this underpainting of the black with the dirty red, so we've got a nice base for the gold. And my first layers on the gold are medium rust and Japanese brown, about 50-50, which makes this sort of off orangey colour, which is really nice for a mid-tone for gold. As you can see when I put it down, it's a really nice colour. It's a really nice sort, almost like an older looking gold, more of a dirty brown sort of gold. And like the previous stages, we're building up a strong mid-tone. For the first highlight, the main colour here, I go in with straight Japanese brown, and I'm painting all the upper facing areas, trying to get good coverage here, but I'm leaving a lot of the previous tones showing. And as you can see from the shoulder pad there, we paint little parts where we create what we call bright spots. And these are the areas that are going to sell the effect of NMM, especially on this gold. Now once I get to this stage, I have to start adding in some pale yellow. We need some bright values as well, which pale yellow has got a lot of white in it, and this gives us our brightness in the NMM, and this is painted in very small areas. Right, we're on to painting the weapon. I wanted to keep the haft of the weapon and the grip like fairly straightforward and a lot of just the same tones. There is a crisscross pattern in the middle there, the hearth, which we might call the grip or the holding part, but I wanted to keep it all fairly simple and fairly straightforward, as I didn't want to pull the attention away from the central part of the figure, her claw and her head, her face. So the first layers I've added on here was deep brown, and then I slowly add light rust into this to keep it a sort of orangey brown colour. Quite a neutral colour, and like I say, it looks nice, but it doesn't draw your attention away from the main model. We're going to do things with the axe blade to make it a little bit, better looking, but I don't really want all the focus on the shaft itself. Now, the first layers of paint on the blade parts, the inner blade parts, is brick red, which is a sort of pinky red, which I really like. Works really nicely. So I go over this, and it's sort of an organic metallic sort of part. It's got faces, demon faces in it. So we're painting it sort of metallic-y, but with an organic finish in mind here. And I slowly add in more and more pale yellow to this mix to build up to this sort of creamy sort of pinkish color. It's not what you'd call a true pink, this. It's sort of quite a sort of warm, creamy sort of color, which I think works really nicely on this blade part. And I also want to separate, because it's another reddish color, I want it to be a different red to other parts of the model, because we've got the armor, we're going to have a cloak and other pieces. So this needs to stand out as being a little bit different. So we're on to the skull now, and I started the mix for the skull with chocolate brown and some tan yellow, and I work this color up to brighter and brighter spots. First of all with the tan yellow, to give that sort of more of a yellowy tone in some parts of the skull. I don't want it to go straight from that quite desaturated brown to a very desaturated buff color. I wanted that little nuance of a yellowy color in there. And once I've got that established, then I'll be adding in this much brighter buff color, which is quite close to white. A really good color for bones, skulls, and anything like that. It works great without going directly to white. Now, one of the best parts of the model is the hair. It's fantastic on this model. And I've used similar colors to what I've done before, where I said I was mixing up a gray here, but I've very much added in basic skin tone with black and a little tiny bit of blue-gray. So, like I said before, I like greys to look a little bit more interesting rather than just straight black and white, which always look a little bit harsh and very non-colourful. And although you can't immediately spot this, there is colour in this grey, and it's a really nice base I put on here to work up this hair. Now, we paint hair in a way where we build up blocks of hair. So as you can see here, I paint a band all the way across, the front part of the hair, and that's the part I focus on to build up the lighter colours. And here I just add in more and more blue-grey just to get it lighter and lighter and lighter until we get what looks like almost white streaks at the front. Now we're doing all the skull and bone parts around her headpiece and on her backpack. And again, similar to before, I've used chocolate here, which is a great colour from AK. I've added a little bit of black and a little bit of buff to this. And with his bones, again, we want to build up to a very light colour, but we also want to keep the contrast. That's why I went with the darker colour at the beginning. And for these parts on the backpack, what you'll see is I start about halfway along the surface. So I leave the darker areas quite prominent near the backpack, and I push the light out to the ends where the actual skull parts are. So this gives a very good look of the main light is all on the skulls and not going all the way in the backpack. It gives a very nice effect here. Now, when I build this up, I'm just adding more and more buff and just getting it lighter and lighter. I very much do this by feel. It's not a formula here. I just keep going until it's light enough. And the paint's fairly thin, so I build that intensity up through layers. I get quite a good light layer here, and I just keep going over and over until it's bright enough. So we're on to doing all the other metal and steel parts of the model now. And again, I've mixed up medium blue, a little bit of black and a little bit of grey blue here. So I like to start the first layers of metals with some colour. It's one thing I find very important. If you go for very grey, desaturated tones, it's going to stay that way all the way through. So by adding blues and colours with a bit of saturation, we get a nice, interesting effect at the end, because you will still see, as you can see in the other steel parts, you'll still see the blue in them, but they still will look like a metallic or a steel. So I go through and add these mid-tone colours here, leaving the darker colour showing in between, which is important with NMM. We need the darker tones. So when you're painting your NMMs, discipline yourself to leave the dark, the black, whatever colour you use as a base tone. You have to leave parts of that showing so that we sell the effect and get maximum contrast from a very dark colour to an almost white colour. So building the tones up here, again, I'm using quite thin down paint, so I get a nice smooth surface. I'm not going to do any glazing or blending here. I'm going to do it all with thin paints. And I'm just adding more and more grey blue to the mix every time. Now, I build that up and build that up, and these highlights get smaller and smaller and smaller to create those very bright, very shiny spots. And we're building ourselves up all the way here until we start adding white to the end pieces, and then we get pure white at the end, which we're going to add as little dots on the upward facing points or parts of each element, which are going to add the maximum shine effect. We don't want this on downward facing parts. Okay, onto the cape here, and I built up the layers quite slowly on the cape, starting with dirty red, which was the original colour that I oversprayed with the priming. And to this, I'm just slowly building up with more and more matte red. I take this very slowly with very thin down paint, and I try and target the ends of each of the folds on the back of the cape. So as you can see, the paint is quite thin here because I didn't want to leave too many brush lines here, and I just build it and build it and build it, and I do a few little glazes in between here and there where I've got a thin mix, and I just go over with very thin paint. The last thing is I just add a little bit of basic skin tone, just to give that little bit of a higher value towards the end. And for the shading here, I go back to one of my favourites, which is Dragon Blood. Right, the last bit to paint is the base. I wanted to do something a little bit different here with the base because it was quite a large flat surface. There wasn't much of interest on the base. So as you can see here, I've got a sort of a black and basic skin tone grey mix here again. And I'm sketching out a little bit of freehand here. So the idea was to have a bit of a circular band with sort of chaos stars coming out, as if she's moving out of some sort of, maybe like a magic chaos circle, or it's a chaos portal that she's come out of, something like that. I'm not quite sure which. But I greyed in the area so that I could see where it was. And then I added some more black into the mix to make it quite a dark grey, and I blocked the whole thing in with this sort of dark grey colour. Now, what I want to try and do here is build up a sort of three-dimensional effect, as if it's burnt into the ground. So it's been magically created or whatever, and it's burnt into the ground. So the part I'm doing here is I've gone back to my dirty red and matte red mix, and I'm painting all around the edges, but focusing on one side as if that was the upper edge that would be hit by the light. So as you can see, some parts of this I don't paint with this edging. I leave it dark as if that's the edge of the fold, but the other edge is the edge that the light's going to catch, if that makes sense. So I put some little spiky bits coming out of this sort of star shape as well, and I'm building up this color closer and closer to the edge, so that until I'm adding more basic skin tone into this now, to try and get a very sort of brightish light right on the edges of this star shape, or these arrow sort of parts that are coming out of this sort of rounded shape. This gives a nice 3D effect at the end of it. So now I have to do the opposite. So on the opposite side, but on the inside, I want those edges to be dark. So I've gone with a more virtual black mix here and painting those inside edges to try and give that sort of 3D effect. So you tend to find that you have light on the upper edge of one part, but on the inside opposite edge you have a dark shadow on the inside. And now I'm colouring in the central parts. I'm picking out one side as the highlighted part, and I go up through lighter greys here, trying to make an interesting inside part, a visual that makes it look as if it's sort of in the ground, it's worn, it's not just neat and shiny and that. I wanted to build up some interest in this part. The finished result is really nice and it looks really cool, I think.